I need to hit record. So, as everyone knows, we are here today to talk about the rise of pet parenting with Dr. Shelly Volsche. And I have a little backstory about why I invited her and how this sort of event has transpired. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have a membership community, and I don't think Amanda and Bianca are here today, but there was a conversation about pet parenting, in particular with regards to letting dogs sleep in our beds and the do's and don'ts around that. And someone mentioned, is it similar to babies and all of that? And so that's where sort of the wheels were turning in my head, because I said, this is a question that I've thought about a lot as well, not just as someone who considers herself a pet parent, but also I'm building a business in the pet care space. And one of the reasons you guys are being bombarded with ads for multiple pet care businesses over the past 5 or so years is that there is this trend called the humanization of pets, right? And essentially what that translates to in pet parent speak is that we think of our dogs as our babies now, especially with millennials. So I started researching a few folks on Twitter, and I came across Dr. Volsche's work. And so I DM'd her and asked her if she would come and give us a talk. And she graciously agreed. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I think your research is fascinating. It's on so many different levels. And I have so many questions, and I hope everyone in the group does as well. But actually, it would be great, because I know I can talk about your PhD work and all of that, but I would love it if you could kick things off by telling us about your progression before you went into academia and where your interest in this type of work began.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody taking time to join us, because I know that for some of you this is late, for some of you this is dinner time, and for some of you it's 3 a.m. So I think you get like the early bird award today. So I actually started out as a dog trainer, and I was doing dog training and behavior consulting in Las Vegas via having done some work in Wisconsin before I moved to Vegas. And in that space, one of the challenges that I was really facing was behaviorism, as we know, is really strong in dog training, really focusing on, controlling of rewards, management of space, those kinds of things. But there was this missing component that was considering how individuals view their dogs. A lot of times trainers like, why do people still use punishment? Why do they still do X? Why do they still use this particular type of equipment? And that got me thinking, like, well, why do they, right? And how does that map onto other components as far as the way that we interact? And so as part of being a dog trainer, I decided to go back to school and got my degree, my undergraduate degree in psychology. Funny enough, I was planning on going the direction of becoming a certified applied animal behaviorist. And I had this like, I'm going to be the next Patricia McConnell type of a fantasy. And then my senior year of undergrad, I took a course called Anthropology of Animals. And I learned about this whole world of human-animal interactions, the cross-cultural research and comparisons, and started to learn more about how evolution of parenting and these kinds of things map onto trade-offs. And that just really opened up a lot of questions for me as far as like how we interact with our animals. So my master's degree work actually looked at how use of aversion in dog training, so use of those kind of punishment and sometimes punitive or abusive even sometimes techniques mapped onto our levels of attachment. And I didn't get to do gender the way I wanted to, because only like 10% of my sample were men or identified in anything other than a cis het female. But I did get a really large sample of women who responded. And what we found was that as they were more attached to their dog, they actually used a little bit of aversion, but it was those management type things like not giving a treat if they misbehaved, using a leash instead of letting them run loose. And so as we looked further into the sample, ended up finding that most of those women were also without children. It was like 91% of the sample didn't have children. Some of them were very in asking that question, were very clear that that was not on the books for them. And so that opened up this whole direction with my dissertation, where I was looking at people who are voluntarily childless or child-free, and how relationships with pets sometimes end up in that world, and what are the overlaps, the similarities, the differences, and also some really interesting dialogue between parents and non-parents when it comes to having or not having companion animals, the purpose of companion animals. So it started to really branch into that area of inquiry that I was curious about. But then by finishing my PhD work, I have this toolkit now to be able to do quantitative like surveys and big number stuff, but also really get into like the rich descriptions of why people have the relationships they have, how they view, how they talk to and about their pets. So it's kind of interesting because the phenomenon of bringing companion animals into homes without children is really not new. In some ways, it actually dates back to the Victorian era. But as you mentioned, it's become really kind of global, not even just here in the United States, but I'm working on a paper right now with colleagues in India that actually addresses the increase of this more parenting type of language, and also the caregiving behaviors are changing, that they're becoming more like that same investment of time and emotion and money, right? Staying home from work because your pet is sick, those kinds of things that are becoming more common. And it tends to be related to you now have this investment and energy that you aren't necessarily putting into children, and that seems to be going into pets. Although with that, I also say there are plenty of parents who are also raising companion animals in the home, either as a way of helping children learn to care for others, or as additional children. So we always make the joke in our house that I was raised like one of the puppies, because my mom didn't really have, she kind of talked about the fact that for her, a lot of what she had as far as skills and knowledge for raising children was having raised a litter of Dalmatians. Um, and so her idea of like how you teach right and wrong was very similar. And that really got me thinking too about the language we use, training versus teaching. But yeah, the last few decades have really started to see the transition take shape. And as you mentioned, especially now in the digital age where we have social media sharing and we have a difference in being able to share this information with each other and talk about it. So that's been kind of my cycle, and now I'm coming, full circle, and there are projects in the works that touch back into my days as a dog trainer, looking at things related to humane education, looking into things related to um, you know, why dogs, how these connections came to be. So
Very cool. And now you're a published author. You've written the book Voluntarily Child Free, and you're also teaching. You're a professor at Boise State, and you teach multiple courses. So it's quite a career trajectory. And it's really cool to see how you've sort of connected the dots between your passions. I know when I was researching you, I came across a hashtag with your name on Instagram, and there was a curated exhibit of animal sculptures. I was like, wow, she's really done a lot of different things. That's really cool. So we've already started to touch upon this concept of pet parenting, and you said that it originally began in Victorian times. What is the evidence of this? Like, when was this first observed? And is it in artwork? Is it in books? How does a researcher go back and look at that information? And what did it really mean at that point, though? Did it really look like what it looks today?
it didn't look like it does today. There are definitely differences. So in the Victorian era, it was still really focused around kind of this kind of idea of kindness being close to godliness. And it came along with a lot of what we see in the rise of Society for Protection of Cruelty to Animals, either the ASPCA, the RSPCA, right? These different organizations. But it was still it was pet parenting in the sense that there was a lot more care given to companion animals. I often tell students that when Darwin wrote Home from the Beagle and other exploits, he often asked about the dogs before he asked about his children. So that's probably telling a little bit about some of the shifts that were occurring. There was definitely still a connection of it being, it's not just an animal anymore, but they weren't quite children yet either, right? There was definitely this kind of transitional space. And cross-culturally, we do see a lot, even prior to that in some of the paleo, well, not paleo, well, kind of in the paleo record. But we see a lot of connections where animals, specific animals, usually dogs, sometimes cats, are really cared for in a way that suggests they were more than just animals to those individuals or that community. And then from there, it's, how do we see it? Some of it is in the way literature is written. Some of it is by putting together pieces. So the Victorian era, especially the turn of the 20th century, is when we see one of the first really big fertility drops in this country. And it's really only offset by the fact that we had also this influx of immigration that made the numbers kind of fuzzy. But during that time period, we had plenty of women who were fighting for reproductive autonomy. That was going on alongside a lot of the voting, right, suffragette work. And so we also have a lot of records of relations of friendships, and that seems to be kind of code for that era of people living in non-heteronormative relationships. And in those spaces, you would also then see cats and dogs coming into the home, because it would be a lot harder if in 1908, it's a lot harder to be a single woman living with a close friend and have a child, right? Whereas today we embrace the varieties of relationships, and we don't necessarily have as much judgment over, the formation of the structures of a family. But at that time, you couldn't have children, but you could still, shower that same level of love and affection and investment on a cat or a couple of dogs. And so you see that in some of the artwork, but you see it mostly in the writings.
Yeah, um, that's really fascinating. I'm curious, and folks, by the way, start thinking of your questions because I'm just going to maybe ask one or two, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone, so that it's not just Sonali time. I want everyone to have the opportunity to ask their questions. Oh, and we got I can read this off really quick
Okay.
for folks who are on the phone, but I think it's Amy, and Amy says, "I'm sure a lot of views on this are very various, like what came first, the chicken or the egg." But as someone who is now 39, my husband and I chose not to have kids. And from adolescence through today, have always felt more of an affinity towards animals. This is actually an amazing segue to my second question, but I'll finish reading it. So I think for some, it might be because they can't have kids, so they treat their pets like kids. But for people like me who chose this, I think also some people don't understand that. Have you encountered that in your studies? And what have been the reactions to that? Example, people who have more of an affinity towards raising animals and them being your family versus human children. Actually, this encompasses my question. So I will have a follow-up, but I'd love for you to take that. Thanks,
So
Amy.
I will start by saying that I am one of those people. And so when I told my mom that I wasn't going to have children of my own, and that I was going to, that she's going to have grand puppies, she laughed and was not surprised in the least, because I spent so much time. When I was a child, I spent more time in the barn with the dogs, the cats, the goats, right? I was always the first one down there to bottle feed the calves when they'd come in the spring, all these different things. And so it was like, did not surprise her at all. I was never in the house knitting or playing with baby dolls. But there's some interesting work. So in 1987, Sharon Housenecht wrote a book chapter for a psychology book. I can't remember the name of the book. But she was kind of reviewing what we did have in literature regarding people who are voluntarily childless or child-free. I'm going to use the word child-free moving forward. So anybody who's a parent that takes that, maybe doesn't like that term, I'm sorry. It's just easier. But so what she found was that particularly for women, but also to some extent for men, there was kind of these two camps. There were early deciders or early articulators. So those of us who, had that experience of not wanting to hang around with babies, but maybe hanging around with animals. I remember being 9 years old and not wanting to hold my 6-month-old niece, right? Those kinds of things. But always having the puppies and the cats in my lap. So, and then there are also what Amy Blackstone calls late deciders. And so she's actually done some work looking specifically at kind of the discussion that occurs between a couple when they do get married and they start reflecting on what kind of life they want to build together. But so she kind of identified that late decider, and then it was with Amy Blackstone, she really kind of went with it from there. And I have some unpublished data that unfortunately just kind of keeps getting put on the back burner, and I really need to get it out there, where I looked at this in relation to when did people first identify, when did they first share with others that they didn't want to have children. And I did find a strong significance between people who had an affinity for animals, who spent a lot of time with animals as a child, who grew up around animals, and those who were early articulators. So this leads me to think that there's probably more flexibility in our parenting strategies as a species, that we're so caught up in the importance, especially right now when everybody's talking about the sky falling because fertility rates are declining. Um, there seems to be this like biological mandate, right? A lot of women have been told you'll change your mind, and a lot of us sit there at our late 30s and early 40s going, I'm waiting for that biological clock and I don't hear anything, right? Some people end up in this space, because they can't, or because life just, they met their partner just too late in life to make it an easy choice, or biologically easy to have children. So there's a lot of variation in how individuals choose to or not have children. And then from there, what role they bring in with animals. I actually did a series of interviews attached to my dissertation work where I wrote a separate paper strictly on the pet parenting thing because of the fact that out of 30 participants, 28 had pets, and I met almost every single one of them via Zoom. So
I have a follow-up to that one.
yeah.
So in terms of what we're seeing now, there is also a lot of conversation, particularly around millennials, right? That millennials are putting off having children. Millennials are buying houses with yards for their dogs. These are all Washington Post headlines, by the way.
Okay.
And millennials are outrunning baby boomers in terms of how much they spend on pets, but also the number of pets millennials seem to be bringing home now. So I'm curious in terms of, this is a huge shift culturally. And I know you are a biocultural anthropologist. What does this shift mean for the pets? Because a lot of this is, we talk about from the human perspective, okay, so they're buying their house, they're spending more money. I'm just curious how this is impacting the pets. Are the lives of our pets improving? Are they changing? Or is something else happening? Have you seen anything around that?
Well, I will tell you that most of the people that I talk to, either in research interviews or anecdotally, when they talk about parenting their pets instead of having children, just to a specific population, right? It's usually clarified that these are not child surrogates. These are not, I didn't or couldn't have a child, therefore I had a dog. In most cases, it's a very specific preference, partially because you're not going to spend, the average cost of raising a child to the age of 18 in the United States is $233,000. That's not counting college. That's not counting any of that additional support to get them to a point where they can be really self-sufficient. And we've kind of extended adolescence to this thing called emerging adulthood. So the expectation that you turn 18 and go get a job and have a family is shifted. And in some cases, not there at all, right? And so that's a component of it. Is it's a preference for a different type of relationship in a lot of cases. Now, certainly, from an advertising perspective, there are those who are maybe running away with it and turning it into the mommy and me pajama sets. And not to knock those, because I've seen some adorable pictures. And if your dog likes to wear clothing, right, that's great. But we're also talking about people who are aware of their animals in a different way. They're paying attention to species specific needs, right? You can have a child in an apartment. You don't necessarily have to have a yard because you can walk your child to the park. You can do the same thing with dogs, but it's not necessarily as easy. And so, especially if you're looking at rescuing from a shelter or a breed rescue of some sort, oftentimes a yard is a requirement, right? We don't put those kinds of constraints on parenthood. So there's certainly those kind of things that are part of the conversation. I also think that millennials kind of get a bad rap because the shift is bigger in your generation, therefore it's easier to say it's millennials. But as a Gen Xer, I know plenty of Gen Xers who are making these decisions as well. So I mean, it's
That's good to hear.
not new. It's not new. There's just more of you, therefore it's more visible.
I'm gonna tell my mom that. We actually have a great question for Mia. And folks, if you want to ask a question directly and unmute yourself, you don't have to come on video if you don't want to. I know it's Wednesday, people are tired, but if you want to unmute, you can ask these questions directly too by raising a hand, but I'll read this one off. So Mia wants to know, she says, this is also a chicken and egg question. I'm wondering if this burgeoning parent-child relationship trend with pets is springing from there being more knowledge about the cognitive abilities of pets. So dogs are using talking buttons. Dog scientists are finding out that more about dog senses and styles of communication. Just wondering whether how we see pets is causing us to get more curious about them, or whether we're learning more and are realizing that they're basically toddlers. I love this question.
So an interesting little anecdote that goes off of the idea of dogs being toddlers. One of my research participants in my dissertation identified not having, or they identified cats as teenagers and dogs as children. And so depending on the level of direct time you want to have to spend caring for the animal, like a cat can use a litter box, right? Theoretically, you can be gone for a full work day and not have a dog walker or a cat walker. But that aside, so I think, and this is an educated guess, I don't necessarily have the research to say which is the chicken and which is the egg and what came first. But I think that our awareness, our research awareness is coming from individuals who are either delaying parenthood or choosing not to have children, or maybe even just choosing to have one so that they can do more of this life orientation towards research and curiosity. But I think that is actually leading to, like, our lived experience is part of what's driving researchers, right? A lot of the people doing this work are coming from generations where you had fewer children or you have no children, or just kind of that. So I think back to when Brian Hare talks about how he first did the distal pointing task with dogs. And it was the fact that he was having a conversation with Mike Tomasello about primates and the fact that chimpanzees, great apes, don't follow a finger point, right? When a person points, they don't follow. And so if they don't, Tomasello's perspective is often, if the chimps don't do it, no other animal can. And Brian's career started with, my dog can do that. Right. And I think that's really where I think so much of what we're seeing and the great questions that are being asked in so many aspects of our relationships with and understanding of dogs is coming from a generation of researchers like myself that are observing things and going, I wonder if that's normal. I wonder if everybody else sees that or does that, or am I the only person who gets on the floor and play slaps with my dog? Right. And we're finding out that there's more and more of us out there, and things like SciComm and things like being able to have chats like this are helping us then have conversations and hear other experiences and going, oh, that'd be a great research question, right? So it is a chicken and the egg, but I really think that our curiosity is leading us to become more aware. And then of course, we share that information and more people wonder if they can do that with their dog, right? So.
Yeah, that's great. So Amy just has a follow-up comment. She says, thank you. And she can tell that having the view I have, she doesn't know if she's technically considered a millennial or not. And I know that's like so different interpretations. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
My dog is living my best life ever. And you hit the nail on the head. This was a preference. And species specific key needs are key. Are you providing your pet with what they need? I think a lot of pet parenting comes down to being able to provide what your pet wants, not what a human child wants.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that attunement, I mean, there was a great paper about the fact that there are, and this was a millennials paper, they were very specific about the age group of their participants, but there were people who were undecided what they wanted to do about parenting. And so they got a cat or dog, depending on the participants. And they found that the amount of attention and care and money and these things, just in taking care of a cat or dog appropriately and to their needs, the veterinary bills, results in oftentimes a decision to say, I'm not going to have a kid. This is enough, right? This is all I need. So
yeah, which actually brings me to my next question. You wrote a paper about whether dog moms have a authoritative parenting style.
that was my master's thesis. It was my first paper as a primary author.
Very cool. Can you tell us more about that? And if you don't mind sharing what you consider to be the other parenting styles as well, for those of us who are not parents,
Sure.
how they would contrast with each other.
Sure. So in developmental sciences and education, there are parenting styles. So there's authoritative, which is a balance of warmth and discipline. So it may be something like, I love you, but I don't like that you did X, right? There's authoritarian, which is mostly discipline with little to no warmth. And when that's taken to an extreme, that's where we often find things like corporal punishment. There is, it's been a while since I've had to do this, authoritarian. There is kind of the neglectful or not really paying any attention, right?
The uninvolved, I think.
Uninvolved. You have the paper up?
No, I don't. I did read it.
Okay. I was like, oh, what's the last one? And then there's the pampering, right? There's a word for it, but it's basically all warmth, right? All warmth, no discipline. And that's when you get the dog that gets away with everything, the child that's constantly throwing temper tantrums because the first thing they get is a phone in the hand to quiet them and target, the dog that reaches a point where they're actually never behaving on leash, never come when called because they've always just been given, right? So within those four, what we found with that survey was, so I started with a survey of 75 common or recently heard training tips, right? If your dog doesn't sit, withhold a treat, right? Or, if your dog doesn't do what you asked. There were even some in there that were intentionally strong because I was coming from the lens of being a dog trainer in Las Vegas, which is the home of Sit Means Sit, and a lot of electric shock collar training, trying not to go too political on that, because that's a whole nother hour.
You're welcome to come back, and okay. I would fully support that discussion.
But what we ended up, so I ran all those through a group of 45 dog trainers and said, tell me what you think the level of aversion is. And so I came up with this set of questions that I was able to talk about degrees of aversion. And then those were attached to a pet attachment scale as well. So people took these two things. And what we found was that almost none of the respondents were actually using shock collars. Very few were even using collar corrections. There was a lot of positive reinforcement training. There was a lot of withholding treats, saying no. So there was this little bit of an uptick in the use of aversion as the attachment score went up, but it was really more like this authoritative balance of warmth and discipline. I have to have just enough discipline to keep you safe and so that you know how to behave in the human world, but not so much that it ruins our relationship and our bond. right? And that very much maps onto what we would see. I call it the suburban mom, right? If you think of the mom who uh, grabs grabs your kid. I used to have this neighbor who would grab her son as he was getting into junior high and was kind of living in this space of looking for his independence and not being a mama's boy. But she would grab him by the collar before he ran off to the bus and remind him that she loved him and then let him go, right? That kind of um, balancing of the systems to keep, so that it's just a developmental thing, right? You have to learn to work within the constraints of your environment, whether you're a dog or a human child, but doing so in a way that is also guiding and loving. And out of that survey, 65% of the respondents I've identified as either their dog's parent or guardian.
Mm.
So that the language and the behavior were mapping onto this mom type thing. And I'm gonna take the lead for a second because I saw Carolyn has tried to pop in a couple times. So Carolyn, do you have a question?
Oh no, I totally missed that. Thank you for
Yeah.
catching it.
I've been teaching online.
And this is going back, it might be a little repetitive to the whole, less about the don't have children, pets, than the whole thing about having that incredible affinity from childhood,
Mhm.
and how it links up, I'm assuming, to women more than men, or females or girls. I'm gonna even use girls. I think of the girl in the horse analogy, which I would have been if I could have had a horse. Um, and that phenomenon, because to me, not that it transcends having a child, but going back to that root, I'm not sure where it came from. I was that kid. I had dolls. I played with my stuffed animals. I drew pictures of animals. I wanted a dog forever. And kids didn't interest me. It's less that it was less, I didn't have that urge that women were like, I must have a child, therefore I'm going to go have a child separately. But I'm interested more in the phenomenon starting in childhood, and whether it links to females more than men, and what that's about.
Okay. So the tricky thing about trying to get a lot of the childhood development type of questions is that when we do research with when we do research with human subjects and we do research with animal subjects, there's institutional ethics boards that we have to get permissions from. And children are considered a protected group of individuals, so that we're not doing anything that could actually be damaging to their development or future selves. So there's a good reason for it, but it also makes it a little bit difficult to be asking questions like this, especially in a milieu where most of your health books, most of your education in especially middle school and high school, it has the language when you have children, right? Not if you have children. And that simple difference of semantics can suggest that if I were to try to get an IRB approval to ask students about their future plans to have children or their affinity towards animals, that I could be leading them to make fertility decisions. And so it's going to be really hard to get permission to do that.
But you could talk to adults. I mean,
And I was just going to go there. So that said, one of the papers that I cite frequently when trying to get to this very point, there had been a study, and it was in Bon Appetit journal. It's not the magazine, but a journal that was looking at food decisions based on attachment to pets while growing up. And one of the things that they found was that particularly women who were highly attached to pets, to companion animals as children, were more likely to be vegan or vegetarian, or somewhere on the, like we call it, low trophic. So they might eat fish, but they won't eat mammals. And it had to do with having developed a different ethic towards animals. Interestingly enough, they also found that men still had that animal ethic, but could also justify that animals are still food. And so they found that men were less likely to be vegans, but they still kind of understood and had some level of respect for that steak used to be a cow. Now, this is an older paper. I want to say it was like 2011, maybe. So it's an older paper, and it was also a slightly older age group. They were looking at 30 and 40-year-old, 30 to 45, maybe. I'd have to look up it's been a while since I've read it. But so there is something to be said about how our ethics and how our connections to animal welfare can be formed by childhood. There are certainly some things that consider this in animal-assisted interventions, how that may or may not be beneficial depending on how those are used. So there is, and like I said, the unpublished data that I have definitely does suggest that people who knew early in life they weren't interested in having children also tend to be more likely to be very connected to animals, having had animals growing up, those types of things. So there is definitely something there. And this is one of those situations going back to like the pet parenting versus, was it the parenting before the science, or the science of their cognition before the pet parenting? And this kind of goes to like, this is an observation that's there that gets touched on in a lot of studies, but hasn't been a study itself. So maybe that needs to be on the plate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that great question, Carolyn. And I'm so sorry for having missed you. So folks, I have an eye on the screen now. So let me know, because I was mainly looking at the chat. But we also have a question from Emma. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Emma.
Emma is actually, she is going to be teaching a course with us. Hi. Okay, I'm going to pull you up on Spotlight. I was like, hello. So happy to have you here.
I was trying to lurk in the background and learn from you guys. Sorry.
Scholars can't hide from
I know.
We see everything, especially in this era of teaching on Zoom. Like, we know how to watch the name.
Oh my goodness, it's so true, so true. Yeah, so I put my question in the chat so I wouldn't get distracted by all this other cool ideas that came to my mind, but I can read it out. So you mentioned, Shelly, and this has been so interesting. Thank you so much for this, and to you too, Sonali. You mentioned for one project that you had much more participation by women than men. And I know this is super common with any animal or pet related survey, especially if it's circulated on social media, right?
Yeah.
But I'm wondering whether in your research you've noticed, is the pet parenting phenomenon in any way linked to gender roles and gender expectations and the struggles of women in the workforce? So the career costs for having children for women, we know, are huge and much more than they are for men overall, So do you think women are in general, even apart from that, more likely to treat their dogs and cats like children, so to speak, than like human children than men are? Or does it vary, and does it vary by generation? Is there ever, I know you've mentioned the idea of children who have a high affinity to animals may be more likely to do this, but for women who want a career, is it just much easier maybe to meet a nurturing need or to have those kinds of interactions with a dog or a cat? Is that a smarter choice career-wise than a human child, maybe even on a subconscious level? And before, I always had a huge affinity for animals. I do have one human child. He's now a teenager, but we used to joke, friends and I, when he was young, the downside of this is I can't just put him in his crate and leave him and go to work for, a few hours, because I'd probably get arrested if I did that, because it is easier in many ways to have that, but you still get a lot of the same emotional connection. So anyway, that was my question that just sort of came to me listening to you speak. So.
There's definitely something to that. So when it comes to women choosing to be child-free, that component, there is definitely something about, the trade-offs of career versus home. It is difficult, if not impossible, to have it all. And there's been a lot of writings about this. Anne-Marie Slaughter wrote a book called Taking something business. Oh, and I just forgot the name of the book. Just disappeared. But if you look up Anne-Marie Slaughter, you'll get the book. And she really argues that in the United States, one of the challenges we face is that we really do value achievement over caregiving. Whether it's careers of achievement, business, going out and getting the deal, they get paid significantly more than teachers, right, as an example. And since those careers are often fulfilled, not always, but often filled by women, that is a second additional challenge. she even cites in there about like how, men will be asked, oh, what a great dad, the socks match today. And it's like, that's just like assuming that men are completely incapable. I'm sorry. They can match socks unless they're colorblind, which is more common in men. So whatever. But so there's something to, but along those lines too, there's also research. One of the challenges is that we have, particularly in Western cultures, although we see it in other cultures as we try to tap into China, Japan, right? Those are areas that I'm trying to get more information on, India. We do see that because of masculinity norms, it's less that it's present and more that men won't talk about it. So Lori Kogan is a colleague of mine at Colorado State, and she had a great paper come out with Chris Blazina that was looking at masculinity and how it maps on to talking about dog attachment, right? And especially among younger men who are still kind of in that costly signaling, look what a great mate I'd be, right? They have to show and demonstrate that they can have control. There's a different expectation of what parenting would look like. And so that tends to map onto their relationships with their dogs versus, elderly men. I mean, some of my favorite people to talk to at the dog park are elderly men who are walking around with their scraggly 15-year-old little dog, right? And so anecdotally, one of the interviews that I did for my dissertation, it was great because I was meeting with a couple and they have this French bulldog named Pepper, who was adorable. I'm sorry, I know we've got a thing about brachycephalic breeds right now, but Pepper kind of looked more like Connie. She had more of an actual muzzle, and she was just adorable. And it was great because the whole time, the man is sitting there doing this. Yeah, she does that. And I'm asking him questions about how do you define family and how does your dog fit into family? And oh yeah, she does that. She does poo poo my silly wife. And before he didn't even realize, I think, that he did it, but he said, "Come here, Pepper. You want to be on Daddy's lap?" And he was the one who had to introduce me to Pepper. So I think it's really a matter of men needing to feel that it's okay to share and show this. My husband has a tag online, one of his like forum tags has in parentheses that he's the puppy and slave to a pug, right? He totally acknowledges like she is his first girl. And so, I mean, I think that there's something to it with men that when they feel more comfortable passing, getting around those masculinity expectations, which, yes, Herzog 2007 is always one of the first things that comes to mind. Women will always take the surveys. If you are at a dog event and try to hand out good old-fashioned clipboard surveys, the man hands it to the wife, right? And that really does present a challenge to trying to get this data, because I really thought I wasn't going to be able to defend my master's when I saw that I had so few men. And I will, incidentally, as an aside, out of that 10% men, a large number of them were homosexual. So again, being comfortable, going above masculinity norms to convey their experience.
So if I can just briefly follow up, so you think it's not so much more that women are more likely to do this or display these sort of real strong pet parenting kind of behaviors, but men don't talk about it. And I agree. I certainly know men who are like, no, this is my baby and you will not. But I just wondered if on a large scale, what other factors are kind of playing into this. Anyway, I see I think there's a follow-up question in the chat, and I'm going to back out. But thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks.
When we talk about parenting investment, so if I'm thinking about something like within anthropology, and again, having the biological and evolutionary component also, humans have evolved to alloparent, which means that we've evolved to be invested in others, those who are not just our children. We see this in foraging small scale societies. We see this in, large, you've got savvy auntie, right? People who are really invested in, I'm going to be a great aunt, and that gives me the chance to kind of part-time parent, right? We see that a lot. And we see, a lot of times when I talk about pet parenting, what we're really doing is alloparenting. Those of us who aren't doing it, I actually had a training client once ask me if I could teach her dog to just sit on a pillow till she was ready to work with a dog. And I'm like, you need a stuffed animal, not a dog. But putting those individuals aside, right? We really are if we're thinking about the needs of the animal, their ways of being satisfied and fulfilled, their engagement, we're really talking about alloparenting them. And from that perspective, there's two different types of care. There's going out and getting resources, right? Getting a job, paying the bills, and I ask questions about that in some of my surveys. And then there's hugging, kissing, cuddling, going to the vet, worrying about them when they're sick, staying home to take care of them if they don't seem like they're gonna be able to be home alone, those kinds of things. So, sorry, I'm seeing great questions coming in, so I'm like, I gotta stop. I chase the rabbit really bad. You got to keep me railed in.
No, these are great. And thanks, Emma, for that great question. I'll just read off Amy's comment. She said, essentially echo what you just said. And she said, when her last dog passed, her husband was just as sad, but almost felt he couldn't express the sadness because of his gender. And that's really unfortunate. That's kind of, actually, that's awful. Like,
Yeah.
to not be able to do that because of some norms that you have to live up to.
And don't ever feel bad if you grieve for your pet the way that you did or could grieve for a child, because that still is an incredibly important bond that we don't give enough credit to. It's not just a dog or just a cat. You know, that is an incredibly deep attachment figure in your life. So.
No, I 100% agree. And I think there need to be better resources for caregivers, because I think there are people in the community, but I've had the personal experience when my cat passed. I was told to stop grieving and, it's just a cat, go get another one, and not friends with that person anymore.
Yeah.
But
you'd never say that to a parent, just have another child.
Yeah, exactly. It's really insensitive and really disregards the bonds we feel with them. But we have a question from Sarah. She said, what differences have you noticed between cat and dog owners? That's a great question.
So this has actually become increasingly forefront in my thinking because I've been working with a colleague who's getting her PhD at UNLV on this very kind of a thing. We had a survey that came out looking at companion animals in the homes during the initial COVID lockdowns. And when it comes, I think one of the things that's happening with dog and cat owners is we still have to get through that cultural barrier that cats and dogs are so incredibly different. A lot of times cat owners seem to think that cats are independent anyway. They don't care if I'm home. They don't need me around. It's a lot easier to leave for a weekend if you just give your keys to the neighbor to come check on them once a day and make sure their water and food is full. Whereas a dog needs a pet sitter. They need to go to grandma's house. They need to go to the kennel. They need to come along. So there's definitely those kinds of things are still really persistent, which is interesting because we've got a paper in review related to that COVID survey where cat owners were much more surprised at the amount of time their cat spent with them once they were home. And Vitaly Shreve and Udell find this, right? They've got some papers looking at the fact that one of the primary reinforcers for cats can often be attention of their attachment person, even over food in some cases. And so kind of looking at and thinking about how we put these cultural biases on our companion animals. And now that we have more and more research to say cats are not that different from dogs. And I love it because here in Boise, you see people with cats on leashes and in their strollers. There was a woman down by the lake recently who had a cat, was not even leashed, but when she clicked her tongue, the cat came running. And I looked at Lucy, who was on a leash, and I'm like, you don't even have that good a recall, right? And you're supposed to be you're supposed to be the trainable species. So I think it's going to be like we've seen with dogs. The more that we learn about their abilities, the more people gravitate. And I think that we might see that happen where more people are like, oh, a cat would be cool, right? And in circles like gaming and computer related circles, you've probably seen some of Michael. I've actually never seen her name pronounced. Is it Mike?
Delgado? Is that
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Michael.
It is Michael. Thank you.
It is Michael. Yeah.
Thank you.
I always say Michael because
it's Michael. Yeah.
It is Michael. Okay. So Michael Delgado, I talk to her on Twitter all the time and I've emailed with her, but I've never spoken to her to know how to pronounce it. So thank you, Emma. Yeah. So, I mean, she's done stuff for like Kotaku, which is a huge like gaming and Japanese culture type website. And you watch some of the videos, like people who do like PC building videos on YouTube and all this kind of stuff, their mascots are their cats walking across the space while they're demonstrating some brand new like $800 piece of computer equipment. It's amazing. So I don't know, we need more personality research into understanding our decisions with cats and dogs, and putting who they really are at the forefront, figuring it out. But that's a whole nother aside. Sorry, I need to stop.
No, this is great. Actually, what
I
came
don't
to
know how
mind.
long people can hang out.
Well, if we go over a few minutes, folks, feel free to drop off. Like, no one will be offended. I do have one follow-up question, and then maybe we can take one more if that's cool. Yeah, I was curious because since we're talking about this topic about differences between dogs and cats, and you have done some research on cultural attitudes towards pets, I can give you an example. I didn't know there was a stigma to being a cat lady. So I got a cat when I was 26. And people were like, oh, no one's going to want to date you because you're a cat lady now. And I didn't grow up here. So it's like, cool. Okay. I didn't know that was a thing. But I'm just curious. Because that's not a thing in India, like a cat is a cat, a dog is a dog. So I'm curious what you think about that. And just in terms of like cultural differences, and are we coming to is the world coming closer together in our attitudes towards pets parenting, or just curious.
So a couple of different papers that I've been involved in, and then kind of shooting from the hip after that. I had a paper that came out. I was involved. This was during my undergrad or my graduate work. We worked with colleagues at the Kinsey Institute, and it was a survey of singles in America connected to the Match.com people and also PetSmart. So this data really kind of looked at a big sample of individuals, and we did find a couple of interesting things. Women tend to look at men with pets as potential long-term mates. Right? We do make that connection that if you're good with your dog, you might be good with kids, right? If you're good with your cat, you might be really sensitive. And relatedly, if you have a cat, you're less likely to date somebody with a dog. If you have a dog, you're less likely to date somebody with a cat. Is that a personality ascription, or is that how are they going to get along if we end up hitting it off and moving in together? That's still kind of left in the mud. But because of that study, we had the cat paper, the cat dating profiles paper that came out last year. And we're working on a follow-up because it keeps coming back. So Lori Kogan and I did a survey where we were looking at whether or not a cat increased a man's level of attraction. And the sample was 18 to 24-year-old women, right? Heterosexual women, 18 to 24, here in the United States, and we presented pictures. And there was a slight decrease in attractiveness. They reported that they thought the men with the cat was less masculine, that he was more neurotic, that he was less dateable, both for short and long term. But it was a small enough effect size that we were kind of like, this is really weird. And we got so much backlash. I had emails from women saying, I'm a cat person. And when I met my husband, he was a cat person. And I would never have dated anybody who wasn't a cat person. And this is just really we heard about how this is making the cat dog divide worse and all these different things. But a lot of it was media spin, right? Because we found that people who had cats, women who had cats, did find him slightly more dateable. People who identified as dog people, women who identified as dog people really found him undateable. So again, this is like mapping on these cultural things we think about cats and dogs that we've gotten from the media, that we've gotten about femininity and masculinity through portrayals of the lone wolf for the man versus the, femme fatale, and attaching her to cat-like strutting, and all these languages that we use just perpetuates the problem, I think. But
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I did have a roommate who used to borrow my cat for his dating profile.
he probably read the first study and was like, I need a pet.
He was Canadian, so maybe he didn't know the American, the nuances either.
Yeah.
Amy just said that her husband is how she met her previous/first dog. take a man in a dog park with a dog.
Yep.
But in all seriousness, we both still didn't want kids. We both knew we still loved and wanted dogs. So this is fascinating. And
You are not alone. There are so many of us.
yeah. And I would actually love to, I know we don't have time for this today, love to talk to you about being, a sibling of a pet, which I consider myself and my sister to be. And I think there might be other folks here who also have kids and also love their pets equally. I'd love to have you come back another time to talk more
Sure.
on that topic, because I think
Sure.
there's so much more to talk about.
Absolutely.
There
My
as
stepson
well.
actually lived with us full time for a brief window. And he would tell his friends at school that he had siblings, but they had 4 feet.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Gretchen says she has a cousin bounder. Yeah. But thank you so much for doing this, Shelly. I really, really
Absolutely.
appreciate it. Would
Absolutely.
absolutely love to have you back. And I think there's so many great compliments that have been coming in. I should
Yay.
copy the chat and send it over to you.
That'd be great. There was a tweet that went around Twitter a little while back about like, what's the one topic you could talk for 30 minutes straight on? And I shared it and I was like, I could talk about anything related to companion animals and parenting, and it would be like 3 hours, not 30 minutes. Like with
Yeah.
no prep, I could have this conversation anytime you want.
Yeah. And I feel like this crew of people would be super excited to listen in for 3 hours as well.
Yep.
So it'd be amazing to have you come back sometime.
Sure.
Yeah, I see a ton of thank yous. I will send you this chat because it's so sweet. People have said the nicest things. But thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate you joining us today for this chat. And I'm going to drop Shelly's Twitter profile if you want to follow her on Twitter, because she does post really interesting stuff. And then I also, would you like me to share your website as well?
Sure.
I can actually email that out because I know a few folks have left.
Yeah.
But I'll send over information if you guys want to follow her and keep in touch. But otherwise, thank you again for coming tonight. We
Thank
do
you.
have a chat actually with Lily Chin, the illustrator, on Friday on Clubhouse. So please join us for that. I know she's an illustrator and this is an audio only medium, but I just thought it would be really cool to actually, minus the art, just actually talk to her about her process and also a little bit about her pet parenting. She is a dog person who just adopted 2 cats. So
she has a long history in the dog training world. And so she can talk about a lot of really interesting things about how you find this information and who to follow.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do a shout out for Emma's event next week as well. So Emma Grigg, who just asked a question about 10 minutes ago, she is actually hosting a webinar for us on Wednesday, which is about helping aging pets thrive in their golden years. So Emma's a behaviorist. She's also a PhD scientist and does a lot of cool research. And she's going to be talking about not just, the pet perspective of it, but also we're going to delve a little bit into topics like compassion fatigue, caregiver stress, and so forth that we briefly touched upon here. So join us for that if you guys are interested. Both events are free. With that, I'll let you all go. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And please be in touch. Thanks
Thank you,
again,
everyone.
Shelly.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon. Bye.
Absolutely. Bye.
Oh, wait, we forgot to introduce you to Francesca.
Oh, Francesca. Francesca, stay. Don't leave yet.
For those who are wondering why we are excited about this, it's because we just discovered that Francesca and Shelly are
Well, we
related.
might be.
Oh, we're related?
No, you're a different Francesca. Hold on a second. This is really interesting. Francesca, I need to see you.
Here, I'm going to spotlight.
Okay.
Volpe, VOLP.
E.
Yeah.
Wait, okay, where's your family from?
Abruzze in Italy. So southern Italy. It's not the Volpe with the I. Those are the Venetian Volpes. We're the Olive Garden branch. We're not those are like the aristocrats. Yeah.
No one told me that growing up. So I'm Volpe with it. My maiden name is Volpe with an E. But it
Oh,
was when we came, what was explained to me from my grandfather, who was one of the first born here in the States, was that when they came from Naples, the name, the way it was pronounced and the way that, the way it's spelled in Italian and the way it was pronounced on the boat, they misspelled it and they just ran with it.
okay. Yeah, I gotta talk to my dad or something because, yeah. Who's your
Yeah.
wait? What are your parents' names?
So my dad's name is Dennis.
Dennis. Okay.
My grandfather was Paul C. And I have Uncle Gene and Uncle Leonard. There's a Trisha somewhere on the West Coast who was like and there's another Paul Jr.